Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a great show lined up for you today. We're going to start with the story that I found, which was really interesting to me and led me to think about a lot of things. So first off, the story talks about how there are some security researchers who took a look at solar panels and how they could exploit those. And so like power grids around the world are susceptible to these solar panels that have vulnerabilities, because the solar panels these days that are getting installed have these smart inverters, which are there to convert that current produced by the solar panel into AC current for your appliances, your house. These smart inverters are connected to the internet because people want to monitor, how good the conversion is and everything, and how much wattage they're generating, and all that is done through remote monitoring, an app, or whatever, connected to an account. And so security researchers modeled an attack on these smart inverters and said, hey, if I compromise this, what else can I do? And they were able to mount or look at a more coordinated attack that could be mounted against the broader power grid. And then another thing that's, I guess, compounding the issue as well is a lot of these solar panels and inverters have a very long lifespan. So at some point, the cyber defenses might become outdated. Maybe they're not patching it anymore. And like, think about if I were to install solar panels on my house, how often am I going to replace those or replace the inverters? Probably when it breaks, really, and not like, am I looking at if it can't be updated anymore? And also
Or
a lot
at
of
minimum, until they became so efficient, there was a ROI, which
right.
I don't know if there's technology in the wings that would even accomplish that anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of these solar panels as well are manufactured in China, which rely on updates from Chinese companies, which we'll get into in our next story. But, China does not have the greatest record when it comes to, keeping things safe and not having, a way in, essentially. So, yeah. And actually, a funny story when it talks about like these smart appliances, I'm actually dealing with an issue right now in the fact that I have Nest smoke detectors in my house.
I have those too.
And if you did not know, there's a lifespan to these things.
10 years.
They will expire and just stop working. So the Gen 1s, I have a Gen 1 Nest smoke detector in my house that will stop working in about a month, maybe less than a month. And it's like flashing a sign to me and saying, hey, you need to replace this. Now, Nest smoke detector is like $100, $120 or whatever. So it's not like a big deal, but I can't find, they're out of stock. They're not on Amazon. You can't get them from the Google store anymore. Like you cannot buy one right now.
Will they discontinue them?
I don't know if they've discontinued it or not. That's actually a good question. I should take a look at that, but I can't buy it.
Well, I did when I moved into my current home. In general, smoke detectors, by the way, have a 10-year lifespan. So it's not just a Nest thing. It's not planned obsolescence, as much as we love to rage against tech companies for that. The detection they use does just go away with time. So actually, I moved into my house. It was almost 10 years old. The smoke detectors in it were turning 10 years old. I had to replace all of them all at once. And I decided to go all in with the Nest Protect. And to your point, Andy, they all have in the software very openly a expiration date effectively where they will stop working because they cannot as effectively detect carbon monoxide and smoke and all of those things anymore. And I was hesitant to buy further into the Nest ecosystem because, it's Google. They love to kill stuff. And I did because I didn't think there was anything really comparable to it. But it was a big investment because I had to do like 9 of them. And it was slightly concerning. So, I mean, if they've discontinued them, I'm sure they'll support them through the end of their lifespan because they know there's a finite lifespan on them. But that's wild. Sorry, continue with your story.
Yeah, it's just kind of interesting because like I didn't actually know that smoke detectors have a lifespan, but like because these are connected to the internet, it like has it built in to tell you, hey, it's going to stop working. Like they're not even going to work. They just shut it off. Whereas like,
a dumb smoke detector will keep working and eventually just start beeping at you in 3 a.m. and you'll wonder why. And it's because it's end of life.
Right. Yeah. And so maybe that's more of the way, because most people, I don't think about, have a reminder in their calendar 10 years from now, I just replaced this. I'm going to, have to replace it again. So anyways,
that's how I found out. One of my dumb ones, I think it was literally the one in my bedroom, started beeping at me in 3 a.m. And it wasn't like, hey, there's smoke in your house. Hey, there's carbon monoxide in your house. It was just this random thing. And I figured out it was telling me it was end of life. And of course, it had to tell me in the middle of the night. It could not have done that at any normal time of day. And that is kind of one of the smart things about the Nest Protect, which you can't buy anymore. But they have this thing called the nightly promise, where when you turn off the lights at night, they do a little green flash to tell you like, hey, I'm not going to bother you in the middle of the night unless there's an emergency. The battery's fine, like everything else is fine. I'm not going to harass you about this later. So you're good for tonight, which is smart because it's like the number one annoyance with these things is it's the middle of the night, always.
Oh, yeah. I just looked it up and they did discontinue the Nest Protect smoke alarm. And they're partnering with Yale or something like that to bring you a new one. First Alert smoke detector. Interesting. It'll replace the Google hardware. All right. Well, I'll have to take a look at that. Glad we talked about it because it didn't even occur to me that it was discontinued.
Yeah.
So
random.
Okay. So all of that, having a power grid being susceptible to cyber attacks kind of led me to think about this podcast that I listened to a few weeks ago.
Well, and before you talk about the podcast real quick, I want to make one bit of commentary. And we do avoid politically pointed commentary on the show, of course, because this is not a political podcast. But you mentioned how most solar panels, these inverters, a lot of them are made in China. This is where there are unintended consequences to things. So as the United States is looking at pulling back its investment in green technology, it doesn't mean everyone sees through that same lens. About half of America does not. It means instead of American investment in green technology, it will be in other countries. And so as people still want to invest in solar panels for their homes, this unintended consequence of removing our investment in it will only further incentivize China and other countries to invest instead. And that's where you'll have to go to get green technology moving forward, like solar panels, inverters, that sort of thing. So just want to point out there are always unintended consequences to things. And this is a pretty bad one where, as you mentioned, it's already problematic. It's potentially going to get worse because the United States and the current administration is pulling back on investing in green tech.
Yeah. And this is mentioned in the podcast. So the podcast that I would like everyone, besides ours to listen to, but this is one that's produced by Nicole Perroth. It's called To Catch a Thief. And I listened to it. It's like a one shot. There's like 9 episodes. And so you listen to the whole thing and it's phenomenal. It's one of the best series that I've listened to maybe ever. But she wrote the book, This Is How the World Ends. She was a cybersecurity journalist at the New York Times for 13 years. And this whole podcast talks about how China has become this sleeping cyber threat and how they've done it through time. They believe that economic power is national security. So everything they do is to try to corner the market on certain things. So like solar tech, for example, like you just talked about, Adam, they're heavily investing in that because they want people to buy their solar technology so that they have a footprint, a way to get in everywhere. And, the podcast talks about some evolution of their cybersecurity capabilities from like the days of the PRC being, military and clumsy, and like American companies would know that the Chinese were there because they would just, they'd see activity come on at like 9 a.m. in the morning, log off at 5 p.m. at night, and they would just know, hey, China's like in here. This is all new to me. Like I didn't know that we knew that they were there and that they were just fumbling around and like nobody cared. And then at some point, really like it changed from the PRC, like the army and the military doing this clumsy investigation, to elite hackers, finding 0 days and exploiting them. And in fact, there was a law that was passed in China, or I think about 10 years ago or something like that, where it mandated that anyone who found a 0 day had to turn it over to the Chinese government. And you saw a decrease in their hackers participating in like 0-day competitions because they couldn't participate anymore. If they found one, they had to turn it over to the Chinese government. And so the podcast is really interesting because of this whole economic power equals national security. China is trying to ways to corner the market in every single area. And Nicole gave a bunch of different examples. I'll talk about a couple that I thought were just super interesting. Like pre-cyber days, there's this company called DuPont, which does some bioengineering, and they have done a ton of research investment into bioengineering corn. And so because we use a lot of corn for things. And so
we subsidize a lot of corn too.
Yeah. And so they were bioengineering corn to grow better, grow in harsher conditions, require less, water, so on and so forth. Right. And so that is no secret. They've done that. And so China has 1 billion people to feed. They eat a lot of rice. And so rice is their primary crop. And so China, again, pre cyber days, made this agreement with DuPont to bring them in. But in order to operate in China, you have to have a Chinese owned company, which therefore is then owned by the government in order to even operate. Like Microsoft operates in China, but it's through a Chinese subsidiary. We have, agreements. And so that's the way that's the government, and you have to have a Chinese owned company in order to operate. And so this Chinese company essentially hires like their lead scientists from DuPont to come over, share, because it's a big market. DuPont's thinking, hey, we're going to create this bioengineered rice and then we'll be able to make a lot of money. But instead, after years of kind of transferring their trade secrets and like researching how to do this, at one day, the Chinese government just said, yeah, we're not going to renew your permits. Thanks for your time. And the researcher from DuPont was like, okay, I have to shut everything down. And then everyone that he trained, all the Chinese people that he trained, went across the street, stood up a new company, and started using that technology. Essentially just stole all of his trade secrets, right? So they are doing this in areas like that. They're doing this in tech. One of the examples, and like there's deductions on how this happened, but like Nortel is was a Canadian company that was a leader in wireless technologies, switches, 5G, like cell towers, that sort of stuff. And it accounted for 35% of the Toronto Stock Exchange at some point. They were hacked by Chinese hackers, and they stole everything, technology, tracked amounts, and then Nortel started getting underbid on their contracts. They started seeing Chinese-made equipment on the market that was basically their technology being sold at fractions of what they were charging. Nortel is out of business today, and the company that has risen because of that is Huawei. Now, that's a familiar name. Huawei technology is actually banned in the United States, but it is very prevalent everywhere else. If you go to Europe, you'll see all their cell towers are Huawei. And so, imagine all of your telecommunications going through Chinese made technology that relies on a Chinese company, which is, essentially owned by the government. All of your data going through there, all of your updates having to go through there. We still have Huawei technology today in the United States, even though it's banned, because it takes time to replace the stuff that's there. And of course, we're not funding that effort either. This whole podcast that I recommend to everyone kind of changed my way of thinking about cyber defense, because when it comes to like, oh, we don't have anything that's interesting. If you have anything that is proprietary, if you have anything that could corner the market on something, that is important to the Chinese government, essentially, because they believe if they can corner the market on a technology, that will shore up their national security. I was talking with my old boss, Doug. He works for a company now that handles agriculture. And so he's like, yeah, we don't have anything important. It's just cow data. We just have a bunch of cows. And I'm like, okay, well, what kind of data is it? And his company is like bioengineering cows to have thinner skin so that they can survive in Africa because they want to export cows to Africa. And I'm like, well, that sounds like it's important. If like China could get the technology to like export cows or like bioengineer cows, they could corner the market and put you out of business. And so it just kind of changed the way I was thinking. Like TP-Link is another example. If you go on Amazon, which I did this morning, and just looked up home routers, the top out of the top 10 results, 7 of them were TP-Link. And TP-Link is purposely, it's a Chinese company, it's purposely underselling, like selling these routers at a loss because they can get these routers into the United States and essentially have entry points into any home, any network that they have. Like
it's good stuff. It works really well. The TP-Link stuff's really good.
Yeah. And they basically sell it at a loss.
Yeah.
And of course, like all the firmware is updated from, a Chinese company. So like the whole podcast just talks about how the rise of the cyber threat, and then like how they are literally in our infrastructure today. They're in companies today. They find it in, because like if like the Chinese government was like, hey, we need to attack the United States or any country today, it takes time to like get in. Like you can't just be like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to launch a cyber attack, right? Like you have to have accounts that are compromised, lying in wait. So they already have these, and they're ready to pull the trigger at any point. They could probably shut down the United States, grid anywhere right now today. They don't, because they just haven't yet. But the hypothesis from Nicole is that they have this in wait for, if we were to respond to, say, like Taiwan, if they were to attack Taiwan, which is one of Xi Jinping's goals, is to retake Taiwan. If the United States were to respond militarily, and then they shut down, say, the Texas power grid, how long do you think the American public would have the stomach to support an island that is, 3,000 some plus miles away when they can't get electricity to their house for weeks? And she talks about how there's like different advantages. Like China has advantages because they don't care. They will target the entire state of Texas and shut down the power grid. It affects civilians. But the United States, we do probably have also, hooks into their infrastructure, but it's like to a power plant that is linked to a military base or something like that. Like we will have military targets rather than civilian targets, and China doesn't care. And also the Chinese public in general have a much higher tolerance for suffering. Like Americans in general, I think are pretty soft when it comes to, like if we can't get gas at the pumps, it's like the end of the world. Like when the Colonial Pipeline got shut down, that was like pandemonium for everyone on the East Coast, right? So there's just like certain advantages China has, and the whole podcast series is phenomenal. I highly recommend it to anyone who's in cybersecurity, and it's also actually done in a way that is very easy to understand for people who aren't in cyber. My wife was, in the driving along with me when we were on this road trip to listen to it, and she, basically understood everything, because Nicole does a great job of explaining basic cybersecurity concepts and everything. So really anyone can listen to it, but highly recommend it to anyone who is in cybersecurity, because it changes the way, for me, how I think something might be small, but this is a big deal that we should try to protect.
I have not listened to it yet. I definitely need to. But as you were talking about it, Andy, and we were discussing today's show before we went on the air, I mentioned how I recently read the book Apple in China by Patrick McGee. And a lot of the same things you talk about, you mentioned kind of like this concept of technology transfer, are really covered in depth in this book. And it is an incredible book that I would agree with you, kind of changed my perspective on things. And it is getting superlative reviews. So Ben Thompson, who lives in Taiwan, by the way, and writes the amazing Stratechery blog, quote, "This is the best book about Apple ever written, one of the best books about China ever written, and one of the best books about tech, period. It's been named a best book of 2025 so far by the New York Times, The Economist, and New Scientist." It's incredible. And it walks through, basically, you mentioned, Andy, strength through economic power. And it unpacks basically how gradually over time, Apple has ceded so much power and control to China through making what look like economic decisions. We can build the iPhone here at the lowest cost with the best suppliers, with the best this and the best that. And by making what were fiduciary decisions, they had inadvertently painted themselves in a corner to which they have an existential crisis on their hands where their fortunes are tied to an authoritarian government. It's incredible read. And you were talking about Huawei and some of these other Chinese companies that make incredible products today. The Huawei phones were really popular in the United States before they became banned and around the world because they had the build quality of an Apple-like product. And the reason why they did that is because Apple has spent so many engineering hours and have sent so many people to China to go literally sleep on factory floors and work 18-hour days and teach the people of Foxtron and Pegatron and all these other manufacturers in China how to manufacture at scale with incredible precision and accuracy and build quality. And these companies effectively did it at almost no profit. Foxconn was making pennies per iPhone sold. Now, yes, they sold a lot of iPhones. There's a lot of value, but they saw the real value of this was the technology transfer, was having Apple engineers literally live on site in their factories and teach them how to build stuff. And they just built up this knowledge and this experience and this expertise over time to where now Chinese companies can build hardware that is every bit the equal, if not superior, to the kind of quality that Apple expects and demands from their products. And that can't be taken away. You could really argue that Apple wouldn't be Apple without China, but China wouldn't be the China of today without Apple. The relationship is incredible there. Again, Apple and China, Patrick McGee, incredible story. I want to go listen to your podcast. I recommend you go read this book because it sounds like there's a lot of similar concepts and theories here that all come together. And then as long as we're on that note, another related book that's deeply enlightening, Chip War by Chris Miller, also kind of talks through how silicon manufacturing today, the frontier silicon manufacturing, of course, we all know TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, and the amazing work they do. But we don't understand, and until you read this book, you truly don't, how incredible modern silicon manufacturing is and how impossible it would be to stand that up almost anywhere else in the world. Like, it's not just something where you can go sign an executive order with a Sharpie and now have great chip manufacturing in the United States. And the amount of investments we're talking about, even at US government scale, probably aren't big enough to truly bring silicon manufacturing back to the United States. So there's all this interplay here that we've talked about with this global economic power and how we got to where we are today. And so I'm going to listen to this pod, recommend Apple in China by Patrick McGee, recommend Chip War by Chris Miller. Incredible reads to really understand where we're at today at a deeper level than just maybe what you hear in political talking heads on like cable news. This gives you the true insight into how these things really work. And so you can understand them and have deeper, more nuanced conversations about them in the future, which I think is highly desirable, is to be able to speak to things from a position of knowledge as opposed to speculation, because there's a lot of speculation of things that are complete fantasy and are impossible. And so we kind of have to focus on what are the rocks we can move. We always talk about on this show, our goal is to give our listeners actionable insights they can take back to their companies and go do something about. And I think having the awareness of what we can and can't do is really valuable when we're making decisions on how to protect our organizations moving forward.
Yeah, that dependence that you talked about, how your destinies are essentially tied, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like with Apple, they can't really survive without China right now. Like it's part of their company. And it's interesting that from a Western standpoint, we have basically outsourced a lot of our manufacturing processes to China, where we are dependent on them. And what China is doing is essentially the opposite. They want people to be dependent on them. They do not want to be dependent on anyone else.
100%.
They want
in depth. Yeah.
Yeah. They want to stand alone. And in fact, there's another example that just kind of came to mind as you were talking about that is we had export controls and all this other stuff against China, for a while on a lot of different things. But one of them was aircrafts. So like Boeing and Lockheed Martin, Airbus, whatever. Like they couldn't.
Well, Airbus is an American company, so never mind.
Yeah, but like China couldn't get airplanes, essentially. Mm-hmm. They were running on old airplanes that, whatever, Soviet produced airplanes or whatever. So what they did was they hacked, and I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Boeing or whatever, but they hacked one of the manufacturers for aircrafts. But not only did they hack the plans, they hacked every single supplier that had a say into these aircrafts and stole plans over time and reconstructed that and basically reproduced an airplane from stolen plans. And of course, like the first couple of iterations were, a little bit janky, but they now have their own aircraft manufacturers and they can produce their own aircrafts now. And so they literally, instead of trying to outsource all of these different manufacturing processes so that they're dependent on other countries, they're trying to do it all themselves. And they're doing a good job of it.
They make great EVs now in China, fantastic EVs. And they learned that from having other companies come set up EV shops there. Mm-hmm. And then again, that technology transfer concept. Yes. And you go back to as well, you might say, well, Apple should just start building all their stuff in Vietnam and India and other countries instead. Here's the thing. If Apple moves too quickly to move some of its output out of China, China could retaliate against Apple as well. So there's this, and because they would still have some there, they can't snap their fingers and move it all out. So as Apple is reducing the amount they build in China, there's this very delicate dance where they have to move it as slowly as possible to be almost invisible, because if they do it too fast, there could be negative impacts on the manufacturing they still have there. So they are so exposed, so painted in a corner, and they are trying to diversify their supply chain. But even in this book, it talks through the nightmare of Apple. If you're familiar with their product line, they make this product called the Mac Pro. It is a very small volume product, essentially only for like Hollywood studios and extremely high performance scenarios. Consumers do not buy them and do not need them almost universally. And Apple kind of did this dog and pony show where they, moved Mac Pro production to Texas in the United States and had the president come through at the time and tour it because, of course, it was a good political view. And the stories of how nightmarish it was to even build this very low volume product there are crazy, because they're talking about how, like, if you needed this fastener, you needed this different screw or something. In China, you could get that in 6 hours. And in Texas, it took 3 weeks, kind of thing, because just how slow Americans move. And we don't have this sense of urgency that Asia does when it comes to delighting customers and moving quickly and being aggressive to win business. It's on a different scale and time than anything else. And if you think of that where iPhone manufacturing, you have just lost the opportunity to build literally tens of millions of iPhones. It's a low volume product, so it ultimately didn't affect them, but it's really difficult because it's not just the final manufacturing that happens, it's the entire supply chain. And everything is made there. Everything is sourced there. And so you can, if you have a problem with a product in the supply chain, you can walk down the street and go knock on their door and say, hey, you got to fix this. As opposed to having to work between different countries and overseas and shipping. And you think of the delays inherent in that. It's incredible. Anyhow, we could spend all day talking about this, but
yeah,
there's like opportunity to educate yourself.
Yeah, so many different examples. Like in the podcast, you talked about some showerhead manufacturer that is a family-owned, small business that makes handmade shower fixtures, and they're like one of the last ones. And they used to be able to go like across the street to get, a nut or a bolt or whatever for the showerhead, and now it's harder and harder to source all of it. So now, instead of saying made in the U.S., it's like assembled in the U.S. or something like that, because a lot of their parts actually come from Chinese manufacturers for the specific nut for the bolt. And they actually did a survey, which was really interesting to me, which was, they said, here are 2 shower heads, one made in the US, one made in China, and here are the prices. And of course, like the price tag of the made in the US has like a 30% increase. And I think the survey was like, I think every single person picked the cheaper one. And I recently got into watches, which is another good example. Like, a lot of people don't want, watches that aren't assembled in the US or assembled in Switzerland or whatever. And a lot of watch companies go to China or Hong Kong to assemble their watches because labor is cheaper there. And so I was looking at this company and I emailed the actually the person who owned the company responded, which was kind of cool. It's a small micro brand. And I asked him if they were assembled in the US. He said, no, they're assembled in Hong Kong with a trusted partner, which of course, Hong Kong is part of China now. So it's still basically China. And he said, yeah, if we were to do that in the United States, instead of $300, this watch would be $600, which would price a lot of people out of it. So literally twice the amount of money for, just having it assembled in the US. And people just, most people don't think about it, but they're also not willing to pay for it either. It's like a pipe dream to say, well, we want all this stuff made in the US. We don't have the pipeline for all the little gizmos and gadgets that require it to be assembled even. And then even if you do, the price of it's going to go up. So who's going to actually buy it and pay for it, right?
People are only as patriotic as their wallets will allow them to be, to an extent. And there's examples of this throughout time where what people will say they want or might vote in a certain way, but then if you survey them, they actually respond differently. And there's a great example where it used to be if you surveyed people and said, do you support Obamacare, they'd respond one way. If you said, do you support the Affordable Care Act, they'd respond differently. Then the even more interesting thing is if you surveyed them one at a time about provisions of the law. If you said, do you support children in college being able to stay on their parents' insurance till they're 24 years old? People universally, yes. Do you support insurance companies not being allowed to deny coverage for pre-existing conditions? People universally said yes. If you walk through the tenets of it, people were very supportive of it. But then when you associated it with the politician's name, all of a sudden that support evaporated. And so there's these things where people say they want one thing, but then act in a different way. And there's examples of that throughout time where, people say they want more stuff manufactured in the United States, but I think their ability to actually afford that and support that is not one and the same. And this is where it gets so challenging, because you could argue in one example that it is an achievement, a success of the United States that we are more skewed towards knowledge work, information work, than labor and manufacturing than we are today. That's a win that we have been able to move that out of our country to other countries that aren't as advanced economically as we are. But now you start to see that there are national security risks inherent with it. And now you get concerned about it, or patriotic concerns about it. I get those too. But it's such a challenging problem. And so when you read or listen to this podcast, I'm sure you got the same thing I got from reading the book, is the book raises a lot of concerns. It doesn't come with a lot of answers. And I'm sure this podcast is in some ways is similar, where there's going to be a lot of concerns raised, but maybe not a lot of answers. And that's the hard thing about our business, is we have to balance that desire to keep improving and doing better. But there's a lot of known unknowns where we know there's a problem, but we don't know the answer to fix it. So we just keep doing the best we can. And that's one of the hardest challenges, I think, of our business.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just having awareness, I think that's part of the problem. Maybe that will influence a specific decision later on, like, hey, we want to do this and we're going to partner with China on it. And maybe that'll make you think twice, right? Like, try to move away from that. This next story kind of talks about, our final story, I should say, maybe one of the things that we could start doing in defense. So this story came across, and I thought it was super interesting. An AI program has now climbed to the leaderboards for real world software vulnerabilities on the leaderboard for HackerOne. So it's a program called XBOW, which is ranked number 1 on the US based leaderboards at HackerOne. And that's a platform that coordinates for people finding software vulnerabilities with major companies. Over the last few months, XBOW has increased its reputation score at HackerOne by reporting more than 1,000 software flaws. 132 have been reported officially discovered and resolved. And the impacted companies include like the Walt Disney Company, AT&T, Ford, Epic Games, so on and so forth. So I just found this to be super interesting, because now, discovering software vulnerabilities could be, or it can be, a labor intensive type of operation. And as we know, using AI in those type of repetitive, labor intensive processes can help speed things up. And now, it's kind of being demonstrated in the fact that they're combing over code and everything and discovering vulnerabilities. And I think, kind of tying this back to what can we do, one of the things is also just using AI in security operations, discovering anomalies of different login patterns, anomalies of authorization and authentication to different things. And that will help you in, kind of responding to maybe a hidden threat that is already there. So anyways, I thought that was super interesting and maybe a good way to tie it off to, think about starting to use AI more in your security operations, like Security Copilot and agents. We definitely had multiple episodes on that going back, but I think it's starting to become more and more important, just to be able to scale to the threats that we have today.
It's literally the example of doing more with less, right? Is if we can amplify human ingenuity and allow humans to do what they do best and machines to do what they do best, that's how we fight back against a potential adversary that can brute force us in terms of human effort, because they have more humans to put effort against us. And this is perfect example of where AI is really good. It's really good at finding anomalies. It's really good at flagging things that stand out from a data set effectively. I know Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales, and we do this show outside of work on our own time and self-fund the show. So when we talk about things, we're giving Andy and Adam's perspective, not Microsoft's. But Microsoft does have a security copilot. And one of the things that recently got added to it are agentic capabilities, to where you can point it at, say, your email reporting, like your user flagged emails for phishing and junk and those sorts of things. Users over report stuff, basically because we've trained them to do it. And what this allows you to do is have the security copilot crawl through your user reports and pull out the messages that are most likely to be true positives, true phishing examples, or true malicious messages for human review. So humans aren't wasting their time clicking through New York Times newsletter that somebody actually signed up for, or a conference that had bought a list of email addresses and was correctly targeting your users, even though it wasn't desired email, it was a legitimate email, and let the humans focus on where they can get the most value from their effort. Or again, Microsoft recently published an article talking about how they're working with healthcare partners to improve breast cancer screening for women, to where the AI is really good at flagging anomalous imaging, anomalous like mammograms, to where a radiologist needs to take a further view of it, but also being able to look at, say, a mammogram of a woman who has dense tissue that often get flagged for further follow-up, like a biopsy, and being able to say, no, there's actually nothing anomalous here. This is fine. This woman does not need a biopsy, which is a very invasive and unpleasant experience. And those are things AI is really good at. And so if we can start turning it to software and being able to find that anomalous code that potentially introduce security risks, that's a perfect use case for it. And to your point, Andy, it does allow us to fight back, because you talked about from this podcast how in China, they have laws that mandate 0 days go to the government. We still, at least in the West, believe 0 days should be handled best through responsible disclosure, through being fixed before they are publicly disclosed, and being closed, because then no one, good guys or bad guys, can leverage those attacks moving forward. We believe in that. And if we can use AI to speed up that process, that's a huge win for us. And it's something I think AI is really good at doing. Now, if you remember way back when we had our very first guest on this show, we had Tanya Jenka on this show. She wrote the book on application security. And one of the things she talked about is how there's this misconception that open source software is inherently more secure because it's open source. Anyone can go view the source code and look at it and find security holes in it. Well, the problem is security researchers are coin operated. They fund by making money from reporting bugs and getting bug bounties in return. That's how they get paid. That's how they put a roof over their heads. Open source software tends not to do that. There is no reward for it. And so although people may want to do some pro bono work, some just out of the goodness of their hearts, at the end of the day, they have to spend their money on, spend their time rather, on efforts that generate money. Well, AI doesn't necessarily need that, at least not on the same scale. So if we can point that at open source code repositories, especially for a lot of this code, as we've discussed when we talked about things like Log4j, that underpins so much of our modern infrastructure, and go crawl those repositories and look for anomalies and issues, and we can fix them proactively, that helps us protect against these bad actors, these adversarial nations like China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, to name a few. This is how we fight back. So that's a really good point, Andy. And I love how we get to end this show on a positive note of, hey, isn't this cool? And this can really help someday. But it sounds like someday isn't a flying car. Someday is much closer than that, because we're already seeing Expo report issues and them being resolved and being closed, which is huge. And we know how fast the state of the art is improving in frontier AI models. It is not hard to imagine how quickly this can evolve. I know we at Microsoft have showed this capability now in GitHub, to where you can literally write like a comment, and we will have an agent go out, design a pull request, actually write the code, and check it back in for human review to be like, hey, does this fix this issue? And that can all happen with literally just a couple of words, a sentence, to kick off that process. So what if we could tie all these together, where we can have an AI go crawl code repositories for issues, and then we can have AI potentially fix the issues, and then just do human review of them. Humans are still in the loop. Humans are still in the process. This isn't taking our jobs or took our gerbs from South Park. It's still human review, but it's allowing machines to do what they do best. And that's what I get excited about, because the less drudgery we can do and the more work that lights up our brains and excites us, especially as security defenders, that's a win. Because no one, I promise you, no one says, man, I can't wait to go to work tomorrow and dig through the user reported email queue and to see all the stuff they reported. No one wants to do that. So if we can make that easier, and then flag the things that are really interesting, and then it's like, ooh, okay, I'll go investigate this. This is the fun part of my job. That's awesome. So this is not to be feared, in my opinion. This is to be welcomed. And I'm excited about where this can go.
Great way to wrap up the show there. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. The links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.